Hello and welcome to How Did This Not Get Made?
We're going to talk about the films that were never released, the scripts that were never filmed, and the ideas that never even made it to the page.
My name is Daniel Kaka.
And my name is David Spencer.
All right, so for our first episode, our very first film that we are going to be covering, this might be a subject that most people know about, The Lord of the Rings.
Yes!
Legend tells of a ring created by an ancient evil that gave its wearer the power to enslave the world. Believed lost for centuries, it has now been found.
Is it secret? Is it safe?
This is the One Ring, forged by the Dark Lord Sauron. Sauron needs only this ring to cover all the lands of a second darkness. He's seeking it all. His thought is bent on it.
No one knows it's here, do they? Do they, Gandalf?
Dan, did you ever watch the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings? How do you feel about those movies?
I love the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings. I have the special edition Blu-ray, DVD.
Oh, yeah.
The extended edition, director's cut, everything.
I mean, I'm sure this was the case for you. Both of us, went to film school and everything. The creation of those movies was kind of our first introduction to the idea of how movies got made as kids.
Yes. And it's such on a grand scale. Like, it broke so many barriers as far as technology goes. And we know that Peter Jackson is one who really pushes the envelope when it comes to technology. There's a few other directors who do that as well. We have some like James Cameron, who's always interested in new technology to tell stories. But seeing a live action Lord of the Rings is something that most movie studios never actually dreamt to ever happen, because for a lot of the times that it was being pitched, even in the 60s is where it started getting pitched, movie studios understood that there would be an immense amount of special effects to be put into this movie, and it would have been way too expensive to actually try and film this live action.
Now, I know there's a lot of people who think they're intelligent film fret people will be like, yes, well, Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings wasn't the first Lord of the Rings movie. Of course, there was the animated one, and what was that, the 70s that came out?
Yes, so it started off as a TV special, the 1977 film. The animators Rankin and Bass were the ones who adapted The Hobbit.
Bilbo Baggins?
Yes?
I am looking to hire a burglar.
Burglar? I'm afraid you've come to the wrong place.
You mean you do not wish to share a grand adventure?
Dear me, no. We hobbits are plain quiet folk. Adventures make one late for dinner.
Enough. I am Gandalf, and Gandalf means me.
Gandalf? Not the Wandering Wizard.
The same.
Later on in 1978, that's where we got the animated Lord of the Rings.
One ring to rule them all. One ring to find them. One ring to bring them all. And in the darkness bind them.
That was done by Ralph Bakshi. There was also Return of the King.
Look! Mine! Yeah! Mine! Ring! Mine! Ring! Gollum has completed our quest. The ring is destroyed in the fires where it was wrought. At last, the ring exists no more.
And that was in the 1980s, so that was much further along. So, yeah, the idea of putting Lord of the Rings on the screen is not anything that was new.
But even before the animated Lord of the Rings, there was another group who wanted to do this movie project, and probably the only people insane enough to think they could pull it off. The biggest superstars in the world in the 1960s, the Beatles.
This would have been an insane film.
It would have been amazing.
So let's break down what happened. It's hard to fathom that the Beatles' career, it only lasted about 10 years. It went from the 1960s to the 1970s. And in 1963, United Artists wanted to capitalize on the band's fame and sign them onto a 3-movie deal. But due to the breakup of the band, they only accomplished 2, A Hard Day's Night and Help. But then you're probably thinking, well, wait a minute. What about Yellow Submarine?
Yeah, what about Yellow Submarine? Have you seen that movie? That movie's wild.
It's weird, it's wild, it's great.
Those blue meanies scared the crap out of me.
Yeah. Now, this should have been their 3rd film, or at least people perceive it to be their 3rd film from United Artists, but the manager of the band actually consulted with United Artists to tell them that no, this is not actually part of their 3-movie deal. Only A Hard Day's Night and Help. So the Beatles' involvement in the film was during the closing scene, and the characters were voiced by actors and not by the band.
Woe is me. Liverpool can be a lonely place on a Saturday night. And this is only Thursday morning.
Well, what about the Magical Mystery Tour? Okay, that was also a movie with the Beatles. That was not actually produced by United Artists. Instead, that was actually produced by New Line Cinema. Now, to help negotiate the deal with United Artists and Apple Films, that was Dennis O'Dell. He actually came up with the idea that the Beatles could adapt the J.R.R. Tolkien novels, and soon had learned that the United Artists had acquired the rights to the Lord of the Rings series in 1969 for $250,000.
Now, I want to just take a moment to look at, thinking about the Beatles plus Lord of the Rings, because thinking about that idea is just insane on its own. But when you really stand back, those were the 2 of the biggest additions to pop culture, especially coming out of the UK, of each of their generations. I mean, Lord of the Rings, when that initially came out, was huge and took the world by storm. And so the next piece of British invasion that the culture has added is the Beatles. It kind of makes sense to combine those 2 forces.
Even with J.R.R. Tolkien, this book exploded. This was a big deal, and I know a lot of the inspiration behind that was World War I. The U.S. had also gone through World War II, and then eventually the books were released around the 1950s. I'll specifically talk about when that happened. But then around the 60s, you also had Vietnam going on. So the idea of war was constantly looming over people's heads, and for people to kind of escape from there while being kind of familiar with the subject was something that people gravitated to. Going into the United Artists getting Lord of the Rings, the series. So them acquiring the rights for the Lord of the Rings and them signing on the Beatles for 3 different movies were 2 separate thoughts. They never actually wanted the 2 to kind of mix with each other. They were hoping to eventually create a live action Lord of the Rings by purchasing the rights to do so from Tolkien. In fact, they were negotiating with Tolkien back in 1967, and they were actually competing with Disney Studios, who wanted the rights for the book as well. Not only Lord of the Rings, but also The Hobbit.
Yeah, I can definitely see Disney's Hobbit. I'm not sure if I could see the Disney's Lord of the Rings.
But this is Disney around the 1960s, so Disney was getting known for doing their animated series. And for United Artists, they knew that if Disney were to get a hold of it, they would have done an animated Lord of the Rings, whereas UA wanted to really push the boundaries of special effects in movies by trying to make this a live-action film in any way, shape, or form. Now, when Dennis O'Dell started negotiating with United Artists, he said that he wanted to create a psychedelic adaptation, which would feature some of the original songs from the Beatles. Now, at that time, when they would have filmed the picture, they would have started filming after the completion of Abbey Road, which was towards the end of 1969 and 1970. So the Beatles were actually aware that they were going to be in a Lord of the Rings movie, knowing that some of their music was going to go into a Lord of the Rings movie. And now, if you listen to Abbey Road with that in mind, it becomes a whole new album. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
We were talking about how popular they were. The books, they were first published in 1952. They became very popular. At the time, all the members of the band would have been teenagers at that time, and they would have definitely read the books. Now, I want to go more into the directors of this movie. Now, one thing that you've told me before, the thing that kind of sold me on this idea was that you said that there was a Lord of the Rings movie that was supposed to be directed by Stanley Kubrick.
Yes.
And starring the Beatles. And it sounded as if Stanley Kubrick was really the one pushing for this project.
I can see how the way I worded that would have sounded like that.
Doing my research, I realized that was actually quite the opposite. So Stanley Kubrick was not attached to the project at all. He was considered to be a director. At the time, the idea was pitched to David and Arnold Picker, who were the heads of United Artists. They first contacted Richard Lester to be the director. He was the guy who both directed A Hard Day's Night and Help, so he knew how to work with the Beatles. But he didn't feel right for the role and stated that there should be a star director needed to make such a massive production. And I kind of get that as well. Like, if you're a low-key director taking on such a big blockbuster movie, that would be very intimidating. Like, you look at someone like Judd Apatow, and you're like, hey, Judd, can you do a Marvel movie for us? And he's like, oh, boy. I'm only good at, like, letting scenes be improv and like actors going back and forth, but like you have me do a fight scene, that's probably not going to happen.
But on the flip side, you look at the actual Lord of the Rings movies we got. Before Peter Jackson made those movies, he had made weird, like, low-budget, like, sci-fi horror stuff. He was definitely, like, weird creature features and, things like bad taste. You would never have expected that guy to make Lord of the Rings based off of his work.
Yeah, and we're kind of seeing that now, even with Marvel. They're taking on a lot of independent directors who have done comedy, who have done horror, and thrown them into the gauntlet of, here's a big blockbuster movie, can you handle it? Like, you see this with the Russo brothers. They've definitely nailed it and knocked it out of the park, being able to take on something like the Avengers twice. And then you had Joss Whedon as well, who, he came from doing Buffy, which I guess is pretty action-packed, and having to do that in such a condensed schedule. He is kind of shaped for that. But you look at Taika Waititi, and he came from an independent scene where he did Flight of the Conchords. He did What They Do in the Shadows. And those are more like closed comedies where you're not really like putting in too much action, and a lot of the sense of humor and a lot of what you get out of those is just the dialogue. I guess it would have been interesting to see if they had Richard Lester thrown into the gauntlet and be like, well, you're doing it.
Yeah. It's interesting also thinking about Stanley Kubrick being considered for this project. If you look back at his career, this would have been about halfway through his career, but this was before some of his biggest movies that the reasons that people remember Stanley Kubrick. At the time, he had movies like Spartacus and Doctor Strangelove and Paths of Glory. And with the exception of maybe Doctor Strangelove, you can look at the rest of his movies and say, yeah, absolutely, this is the guy I want to have make my sword and sorcery fantasy movie.
What movie was it that he really blew up?
Spartacus is probably one of the big things that got him a ton of acclaim, but I think the movie that solidified him as one of the greatest filmmakers ever is 2001: A Space Odyssey, which is, of course, one of the reasons, I'm sure of many, that he didn't do Lord of the Rings, but instead he went on to do A Space Odyssey.
I guess he kind of recognized that a lot of this technology was there, but he also understood a lot of the limitations. And I'll go more into this later about Star Wars coming out around this time as well. So people are looking at Star Wars as like, wow, there's so many special effects in this, and you can go special effects heavy in a movie and it'll be all right, and it is profitable.
Yeah. And this is 10 years before Star Wars, though. The only thing I wanted to say about Stanley Kubrick as well, and part of the other reason why his name being in the story makes it such a fascinating story, you think about Stanley Kubrick has so much notoriety for being such a controlling director. He very much wants exactly what he wants, and he can be extremely demanding. You look at stories from the set of The Shining and just kind of see what type of filmmaker Stanley Kubrick is. He wants things to be done a very specific way. And if you combine that with the Beatles in the height of their drug-fueled days, it would have been quite the behind the scenes.
In knowing how the Beatles act during even interviews, and you can tell that they're just messing around all day. They're messing around.
Got a very informal approach. We've got no formula at all, for writing songs. We just do it as it happens. Sometimes John can write a line of a song. He can come up and say, things like that. He could say that. He could just say that. He could just say that to me, and I could say, "No, John." And often I disagree with Paul and say, "This has been done so many times, it's killed it." But then sometimes, we have a real row, and I say,
I feel like it would have been an absolute nightmare to actually put these two together.
Yes, yeah.
So another director that was considered was Sir David Lean. He was the director of Lawrence of Arabia.
Yeah. And Dr. Zhivago. I didn't hear that David Lean was considered, but that also makes a ton of sense.
Yep. Did The Bridge on the River Kwai. Now, paired up with him was writer Robert Bolt, who wrote Lawrence of Arabia and Dr. Zhivago. They wanted him to adapt the novel, knowing that those two worked really well.
Yeah, absolutely. Lawrence of Arabia especially is such a big, sweeping epic, and Dr. Zhivago both. Those are the kinds of movies that you don't really see as much anymore, except in a movie like The Lord of the Rings, where there is so many stories going on. Lawrence of Arabia is one of those movies that feels like it's lasting 3 hours. Not in a bad way, not that it's like long and boring, but in the fact that there's so much into the story that they're trying to tell. It really feels like you are watching somebody's life.
Actually, I think he would have been a great director for that if he had taken it on.
Absolutely.
And Lean did not turn this down. He was interested at first, and he actually wanted to do it. And actually, he was a fan of Hard Day's Night. And he mentioned that if he wasn't working on his movie at the time, which was Ryan's Daughter, he actually had this to say: "It's a very interesting idea, Dennis. Unfortunately, I'm tied up at the moment with a little love story I'm going to put out there." After that exchange, that's when Dennis got in contact with Stanley Kubrick, who had actually never read the books before.
That surprises me.
Yeah. He sent him a copy of the novels when he found out about this. With Robert Bolt also out of the way, they wanted Michelangelo Antonioni, who was a Italian screenwriter. He did Blow Up, La Avventura, The Passenger, La Amici, and they wanted him to then adopt the novel into the screenplay. That was all going on. On the other end of things, we have the Beatles. When the band read the books, they were reading them again, and they started casting themselves into the roles that they wanted to play. John Lennon, he first wanted to be Gandalf, and then he swapped with Harrison so that he could then play Frodo. But Paul McCartney already called it.
Oh, poor John Lennon.
Yeah. And then Ringo was like, all right, well, I'm Sam.
It really sounds like Ringo made the smartest moves here. He's like, I know I'm not going to get Gandalf. I know I'm not going to get Frodo. So I'm going to make sure I'm not saddled with Gollum. And I'm just going to claim Samwise now.
He made a very smart decision because that the casting director would have looked at him and there was like, you're Gollum. But here is the final lineup. So we have George Harrison as Gandalf the Wizard, Paul McCartney as Frodo Baggins, Ringo Starr as Sam Gamgee, and then John Lennon as Smeagol or Gollum.
Oh boy. You know, when I first heard about this story, I heard those names in a different order, and I know I talked to you about this as well, and then after you and all of your wonderful research, you were like, no, that's wrong, and then I realized, yeah, I got it wrong this whole time. Maybe I just headcaned it, because what I think really makes the most sense is Paul as Frodo, obviously, George as Sam, John as Gandalf, and Ringo as Gollum. Of course you make Ringo be Gollum. Didn't Ringo have that Caveman movie? He would have been a perfect fit.
He will protect them from all the beasts of the earth. Ringo Starr, Caveman. They don't call it the Stone Age for nothing.
I can tell that he was like gunning for like, I'm not going to be the ugly one in this movie. Not again. So on top of them being in the main roles, they wanted a lot of their friends to fill in a lot of the supporting roles. Oh, I get by with a little help from my friends. Including Leslie Lawson, who was also known as Twiggy. She was a British singer, actress, model, and she was going to play Galadriel. That's the only one that I could find that they were gunning for. This was not official in any way, but that was the only other role that was attached to another actor.
Yeah.
Let's go back to Stanley Kubrick. Now, he read the books, and he said they were excellent, but unfilmable.
As so many people have said about those books for such a long time.
Mm-hmm. And Peter Jackson said, hold my Miravur. I don't know how to say it. I know that. I looked up Lord of the Rings cocktails, and this was like an elven drink.
I don't remember that at all.
That might be a deep cut, so we'll find out. Or I might be completely wrong. Who knows? So to try to convince Kubrick to take on the project, Dennis arranged for John Lennon and Paul McCartney to have a lunch with him to discuss the ideas even further. Now, Kubrick was mildly interested, but convinced that the movie involved way too many special effects, and Lord of the Rings fans would not like the changes made to adapt the book to the screen. And I'm sure Stephen King can attest to that for sure.
Yeah. Although, you know, I can't really speak for The Shining. I know that's something that a lot of people get up in arms about whether or not Stanley Kubrick's changes should have happened. But if you were going to make Lord of the Rings as one movie, which it sounds like they were planning on doing, you'd have to change so much about those books.
Yeah. And even Peter Jackson made some changes as well.
Yeah.
I mean, he was more faithful to the book than, I guess, other adaptations that have been made. But I always love this, not analogy, but this comparison between people who have read Lord of the Rings versus people who have not read Lord of the Rings, and have them both watch the end of Return of the King. And for me, I've never actually read the books, and when I watch the ending of that, it feels like it ends 20 times. It goes on for like an hour. And for me, not reading the books, it feels like the ending took a very, very long time, as opposed to those who actually did read the books. They have the opposite opinion, saying, oh yeah, Peter Jackson cut out way too much stuff and that ended way too soon.
Yeah, you've got the whole scourging of the Shire, which is such a big deal in the books, this big deal that, you know, even after all of this, the Shire still gets destroyed in battle. While we're talking about adaptations, and I'm sure this will be a subject that would come up many, many more times on this podcast, but, you know, I think what's amazing about Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings is that Peter Jackson, the other writers for the Lord of the Rings scripts, they were really thinking of, you know, what is the spirit of the story? What is the spirit of these characters? How can we tell a story that matches that? And the thing is I think that the characters are still the same. The meaning of the story is still the same, even if some of the plot beats don't match up.
Yeah. And a good example of like adapting novels to the screen, and there's always been a pet peeve of mine for anyone who says that the book was better. For me, that kind of puts up like a gatekeeper type feel. And it's like, well, I took the time to read the books and you just sat there for 2 hours and experienced the same story that I've been living with for months or weeks at a time. Like, I deserve the story more than you deserve the story. And for me, when I look at the novel versus the movie, I feel like they're two completely separate monsters.
Absolutely.
And how you show that story on the screen versus how you can tell it in the books is so vastly different, because you can get inside of the heads of the characters inside the book so much more easily than you can showing it on screen. The example I like to give is of the Hunger Games. So in the Hunger Games, in the books, Katniss Everdeen, when she is going through the first game, there's so much going on in her head. Even in her head, she's explaining the rules of the game. Now, when it came to the movie, it would be really absurd for Katniss to like look at the screen like Alfie style and say like, here's what's going on. So here's the game. We all have to kill each other. Only one person remains. We'll see what happens. Like, no, that would make no sense for Katniss to do something like that. Instead, they added in the announcers, which were never in the books. The announcers were there to kind of explain how the game works and kind of get into the heads of the different characters. I think one of the first victims were getting stung by a bunch of bees as well. Those announcers were able to explain what those bees could do. Whereas in the books, Katniss Everdeen was the one to explain how deadly these bees actually were.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like experiencing a story on the screen should just stay as the screen. Experiencing a story in book form, you should enjoy it as the book form.
Yeah.
Although Chuck Palahniuk has actually stated that Fight Club was a much better movie than it was a book.
Yeah, as you were saying that, I just had a tab open with his name because I was going to bring up the same thing.
After Stanley Kubrick had left the project, saying, nope, not going to do it. It's not filmable. They got Heinz Edelman, who is the art director of Yellow Submarine, and he pitched the adaptation to United Artists to make it in the style of Disney's Fantasia, or make it like a animated rock opera. And he wanted the members of the Rolling Stones to star in this movie.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, but then later on found out that the Beatles were actually attached to this Lord of the Rings project, so he kind of scrapped that idea and was like, you know what? I'm going to get the even bigger British band to take over.
Be careful. You're going to make some Rolling Stones fans angry.
I love the Rolling Stones. I think they're great. So bring it. He was then denied by United Artists because they were still insistent this needs to be a live action movie. If we wanted it to be animated, we would have let Disney get it.
Yeah. I could definitely see why they'd make that decision. If you've got something as popular as Lord of the Rings, you're going to want to make a movie that everybody will want to see. And animation at the time, and still is, something that is only really seen as a children's medium.
And that's kind of unfortunate when it comes to the medium of animation, because early on in Japan, they recognized what animation could be used for. And it got around a lot of special effects, and eventually it became just a medium to tell a story. It's not looked upon as like, this is just a children's thing. I know we're starting to steer away from that as an American society, especially since we're getting more TV shows and movies that are animated that is for adults. So I think especially something like The Simpsons really helped bridge that gap. And I think Disney was the one who really set the tone for animation being for children by kind of taking fairy tales, which stories that were originally for adults, and you take that and you water it down so it's acceptable for children to watch, so that you can get more people into the theater, because not only are children watching it, it's the children and their parents. So you are doubling the amount of tickets that you can sell just by making a children's adaptation. Even though it is stated that Tolkien eventually stopped the production from happening, it was actually the lack of the Beatles that eventually killed the production. And eventually when they split up, they just said, well, that's it. There was so much going for the Beatles being in Lord of the Rings. They were trying to make it happen, and now that they're broken up, probably not going to happen.
Yeah, it's the breaking of the fellowship.
Now, that did not kill the story, and that did not kill the pitches, because we got another pitch.
Oh, this is interesting. I always thought when I heard about this story that this was the end, that Beatles Lord of the Rings was done.
There's a much grander tale to be told when it comes to Lord of the Rings. Just when you think it's over, you get smacked in the head with 3 Hobbit movies, and you're like, you thought I was done? No. So let's bring it back to 1969. We have writer, director, producer John Boorman. He is known for Hope of Glory. Deliverance. Yes, the one with Burt Reynolds. He actually adapted the novel, hoping that the Beatles would still be interested in it. And he finally finished it in 1970. Which, if we know our Beatles history from Alphabetical, they broke up in, I think, September or August of 1969. So he just missed the boat. Oh, man, I feel so bad. But anyway, at the time, United Artists had commissioned Sir Peter Schaefer to write a treatment for a 3-hour movie, but nothing came of that. Arlo Guthrie even pitched an idea for an animated Lord of the Rings. Do you remember who Arlo Guthrie is?
I don't.
You can get anything you want.
You want at Alice's restaurant.
Oh, yes, of course.
Yes. So he wanted to do his own adaptation of Lord of the Rings, which would have been, I mean, knowing Alice's Restaurant and the epic that he made with that, and knowing that the Beatles wanted to make a musical adaptation for Arlo Guthrie to step and be like, okay, you want to make it a musical? I'll make it a musical. In fact, I will make a 3-hour-long musical. All right? I've done this before. Let's do it. But United Artists, again, still adamant, this needs to be a live-action movie. Cannot be animated. So, the reason why Boorman had gotten the gig to write Lord of the Rings is because he had a 2-picture deal with United Artists. He had finished his first movie, Leo the Last, and was trying to pitch a film that he had in mind since 1962, all about Merlin the Wizard. Instead, UA gave him Lord of the Rings, and they're like, you know what, it's kind of similar, you figure out Lord of the Rings. So he's like, okay, yeah. And he actually consulted with Tolkien about creating the film, and he intended on having either children or small people play the hobbits and have them be voiced by adult actors. Tolkien did not like this idea and said the film should be animated. It's best adapted if it was animated, which we know that United Artists, if you say animation, they're like, nope, can't do it. So Boorman then teamed up with Rospo Pellenberg to modify and make changes to the story that were not included in the books. All right? Yeah. So Kubrick had warned about this, but they decided to do it anyways. Like Gimli is put into a hole and is beaten to retrieve the password to Moria by recalling an ancestral memory.
Wait, what? Is that like the Fellowship who puts him into a hole and beats him?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yep, that was the only way. Frodo and Galadriel have sex.
Oh, what? That doesn't even make any sense. Why?
I don't know.
Oh, man.
I don't know. Let's see. Arwen is made into a teenage spiritual guide and is still Aragorn's love interest.
Ooh.
That's so uncomfortable. Okay. And then Aragorn's healing of Eowyn takes place on the battlefield and I guess has a lot of sexual overtones.
I mean, Aragorn's got a lot of sexual overtones with everybody.
You have my sword.
That's true. Yeah. And then eventually United Artists realized that this production is going to be too expensive. We're not doing it. And then Boorman, having the script in hand, he was like, well, someone wants a script. Like, you had Disney fighting for the script, and finally he'd adapted it into a screenplay. So he actually went over to Disney and said, I actually made it. You guys can buy the rights for this. And knowing the nightmare that United Artists had gone through for 3 or 4 years trying to get this off the ground and nothing was happening, they're like, no, if UA realizes that this isn't going to work, what makes you think Disney's going to realize that it's going to work.
Yeah.
So they all passed on it. He gave up, and he later found a new hope when he saw that studios were getting big success from doing big special effects films like Star Wars. And this is where Borman came in and pitched to UA his second film. It wasn't going to be Lord of the Rings. Instead, he pitched the Merlin script that he had been trying to adapt since the early 60s. And that is how he got greenlit to make Excalibur.
Oh.
Rise, King Arthur.
In fact, he used the same locations and special effects techniques that were intended for the Lord of the Rings movie to make that film.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So really, this whole time, this Lord of the Rings project, he really wanted to make Excalibur, it sounds. That's the project he'd been working on for even earlier.
Yes. So because the Lord of the Rings, John Borman got his dream movie of making a Knights of the Round Table, Merlin, King Arthur movie, Excalibur.
Interesting.
And that's how Excalibur was made.
Wow. After that, we get the animated movie, and then we get, finally, Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, the movies that we now know as the definitive filmic adaptations.
Yes. Now, the story still doesn't end here. Much like Return of the King, this podcast will end like 50 times before it actually ends. There was a filmmaker, Alex Sorkin, no relation to Aaron, but spelled the same way. He actually made a deepfake video of a trailer for The Lord of the Rings, which he called the Beatles ship of the Rings. And he actually took clips from Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings and actually superimposed all the Beatles onto their correct roles, as I had actually stated before. So Paul McCartney was Frodo, Ringo was Sam, George Harrison was Gandalf, and John Lennon was Gollum. And not only was John Lennon, his face put on Gollum, but his glasses.
Yeah, that was such a weird touch.
Yeah.
It was also weird watching that deepfake trailer and seeing mustaches on all the hobbits.
I'm sure they would have shaved for the roles. Maybe. I don't
know about that.
Actually,
Understanding of the hobbits now is that kind of boyish look, and I know a lot of that comes from the illustrations of the hobbits, but I would not be surprised if the Beatles were going to put their own spin on it.
Yeah, of course they're going to put their own spin on it. Like, that's why you get the Beatles. It's like whenever you have Chris Pratt in anything. Like, when you use Chris Pratt, there's a certain way that you should use him. So you have Chris Pratt, and I think the best role that he's been in was Parks and Rec. So if you take a look at something like Guardians of the Galaxy, they took on that goofy Chris Pratt, and it makes that movie so much more different. Whereas you take Jurassic World, they just decided that, Chris Pratt is just hot guy. And that's the role that he's going to play, and he doesn't really, lean into the Chris Pratt of it all. Even Jeff Goldblum, again, to smash Jurassic World. When they used Jeff Goldblum, they did not use him correctly at all. Like, he was at the court hearing. It was basically the equivalent of him Skyping into a movie. That's what it felt like. And they're just like, just read these lines. Whereas the first Jurassic Park really utilized him. Even the second Jurassic Park utilized him very well. And again, going to Marvel movies, when Taika Waititi was directing him in Ragnarok, that was peak Goldblum right there. And that's how to efficiently use them. So I think with the Beatles, we would have seen that. If Stanley Kubrick were to bring on the Beatles to do Lord of the Rings, even if they got greenlit, even if they started shooting, I guarantee you this production would have shut down because Stanley Kubrick would have been so frustrated with them.
I can't imagine them getting past day one of filming. I think the $1 million question here, would you actually watch this movie?
On two separate notes, I would want to see a Beatles Lord of the Rings, but I don't want it to be made by Stanley Kubrick. And I want a Stanley Kubrick Lord of the Rings, but I don't want it to star the Beatles.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to say I would 100% watch this movie because of how insane a thing it would be. It would be unlike any other movie ever made. There would be nothing like it. And I think I'd agree with you there that I would rather see one or the other. I could see a Beatles, David Lean, Lord of the Rings happening, and or who it sounds like really should have been there from the beginning, John Boorman. He seems like it would have been the perfect person to be attached to this. Also, of all of the variations of this, the Heinz Edelman animated rock opera of Lord of the Rings, that is something that I think absolutely could have been made and would be one of these really, really interesting pieces of just visual art,
So I think I'm going to agree with that one. If Heinz Edelman actually went on to make his animated version and actually use the Beatles as the actual voices instead of in the Yellow Submarine where they use actors, I think that would have been interesting. Or, you know what? I'm going to go with Arlo Guthrie. Hands down. You know what? Beatles are out. Stanley Kubrick's out. You know what? Just make Arlo Guthrie just the looming narrator throughout this animated Fantasia type movie.
Yeah. Oh, that would have been wild.
Yeah.
Do you think this would have actually been worth making? Would it have been successful for the studio?
I think it would have been successful. Yes.
You can't go wrong. It's the Beatles and Lord of the Rings.
Yes. So you would have had the name recognition of the Beatles. So a lot of people would have gravitated to the theaters for that. And then you have a big name like Stanley Kubrick also bring people to the theater. And then you have the name recognition of Lord of the Rings, one of the biggest books in the 50s and into the 60s. So, yeah, I definitely think it would have made a lot of movies.
I think even if the movie stunk, people would still have gone to see it in droves, especially if, this was the time that the Beatles... if you imagine the amount of time it would have taken for this to be in production and post-production, they could have filmed and then the Beatles broke up between filming and release. That alone would get so many people buying tickets.
Oh, yeah. This would have been like a cult classic.
Yeah. Like Dune is kind of how I feel about it.
I was going to say The Crow.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because in the middle of that, you lost Brandon Lee, and they had to rewrite it, while they were shooting, and that production was already a mess, which is kind of why Brandon Lee got hurt and eventually was killed on set, was because they were shooting for long hours, and their props guy didn't fully check the gun before it actually went off. So, that's a good downer note. But yeah, I feel like this would have been one of those movies, did you know that Stanley Kubrick made that? I didn't know that Stanley Kubrick actually directed Spartacus.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's not really advertised that it's one of his movies, because when you think of him, you think of The Shining, 2001: A Space Odyssey, Doctor Strangelove. You have all these major hits from him, and I remember Spartacus being such a huge cultural movie.
Yeah,
and yet...
but it wasn't the same kind of cerebral movies that he became known for later on. A filmmaker that we've had who has done a big commercial success, but then most of the rest of their movies are these kind of stranger, more introspective, cerebral movies.
Why would you talk about M. Night Shyamalan that way?
Spartacus at the time would have been like superhero movies are now. It would be like if Paul Thomas Anderson had made Batman before he went on to make things like The Master.
Yeah. Or if you got Tim Burton to direct the Spice Girls movie. I feel like that is a better perspective.
Absolutely.
Or Christopher Nolan taking on One Direction to be in his movies. Wait. Hold on. I think that may have happened.
Wait, what? Oh, he cast Harry Styles in Dunkirk. Oh, interesting.
Yes. So maybe Lord of the Rings with the Beatles would have been good.
Yeah, maybe.
Okay. So, I take that back.
Well, are there any changes that you would make to the story to make this be as successful as it could possibly be?
I think the Beatles being the main characters.
I mean, I would change the casting, switch around those characters.
Yeah. I think if you sprinkled in the Beatles, it's kind of like when Game of Thrones, when they had Ed Sheeran on for an episode.
Don't bring up Ed Sheeran and Game of Thrones.
But here's the thing is that They sprinkled him in there. That's it. Like, you don't need him to be a main character. You can just sprinkle him in there. And I think the Beatles could have been the same way. Like, don't give him the lead.
John Lennon be Elrond, and somebody could be Tom Bombadil or something like that.
Yeah. Like, don't give them the major roles. Let Stanley Kubrick be in charge of who he wants to be the major roles. And then outside of that, you sprinkle in the Beatles. That would have made a much better story.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Well, one thing that I always love to consider about these is, if this movie existed, how would our film world be different? If this movie happened, number one, that would have meant that Stanley Kubrick, if he was the one attached to this film, probably wouldn't have made 2001: A Space Odyssey. Mm-hmm. And we wouldn't have the same Stanley Kubrick career that we know from him.
It's hard to think of, like, what if. Like, you think of a director like M. Night Shyamalan, who came out of the gate doing Signs and The Sixth Sense, which were huge movies and so well done, so well crafted. I remember studying The Sixth Sense when I was in film school, and like how well he was able to put together scenes and craft them and even edit scenes together. And for him, like, his movies took a turn where people expected the twist, and it felt like he was taking on these deals that maybe he wasn't fit for. So like something like The Village or The Lady in the Water. And I don't know, I feel like the studios were trying to, once they saw what he could do, try to fit him into different molds, hoping that he could take that and succeed with it. And instead he didn't. And I don't know, I don't want to blame him for making any terrible movies. And I don't want to say that he's the reason for, like, why Avatar or The Last Airbender was so bad. I feel like he was given such a huge story, and he just didn't have the time to tell that story properly. Like, he was already set up to fail because of that. So now M. Night Shyamalan is part of Blumhouse, and now he's making stuff like Split, and he's making, what was the one where it was the kids who went to their grandparents' house? Like,
Grandma's House.
Something like that, yeah.
Wasn't it called Grandma's House? Maybe it wasn't.
No. That was a Happy Madison film.
The Visit. That's what it was called.
Yeah.
Way more ominous than Grandma's House.
Yeah. So, yeah, Blumhouse, like, gave him a platform where he can really succeed. And now it's no longer a name that you associate with, like, all bad movies. Like, he's really been on this upturn just because you're letting the director do what he does best. So I think the success of The Lord of the Rings would have happened if you let Stanley Kubrick do what he needs to do and sprinkle in the Beatles wherever he thought they could fit in. And I think that would have been an incredible movie.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. And then he would be the director known as the guy who made Lord of the Rings.
That's true. But on the flip side, we probably wouldn't have Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings. And I think what's amazing about Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, you know, we have filmmakers like Stanley Kubrick where their voice is so key. And not to say that Peter Jackson doesn't have a voice, but he definitely did not let himself get in the way of the story. Those movies are Lord of the Rings movies before they are Peter Jackson movies, before they could be attributed to any of the stars. It really felt like a project that everybody working on it kind of recognized that this is they're a piece of something bigger than them, and it created such a massive cultural thing. I'm not sure especially with the name of Stanley Kubrick and the names of the Beatles, those would be a Stanley Kubrick movie first or a Beatles movie first. And I'm glad that we have a Lord of the Rings that is a Lord of the Rings movie first and foremost.
Yeah.
Before we wrap this up, there is one more postscript that I found in my research that kind of brings this whole thing full circle. So when I was initially hearing about this, the reason I heard about this and the reason why the story of the Beatles' Lord of the Rings kind of got a lot of traction where journalists online were wanting to find out more information about what happened is because at a premiere of one of the Lord of the Rings movies, I don't recall which one, and for some reason I couldn't find the article today, but he had mentioned to a reporter that he talked to one of the Beatles at the premiere, probably Paul McCartney who was visiting the premiere, and said, hey, we tried to make a Lord of the Rings movie back in the 60s. And that was one of the things that sprung the story to get out there and to people to start researching what happened. Well, Peter Jackson is a big Beatles fan. I don't remember which one of his productions it was, but they actually had their cameras on set named after the different Beatles. And it was announced recently, Peter Jackson has actually been working on a documentary called Get Back, which is about the final recording sessions and the breakup of the Beatles.
Yeah.
And so that's a documentary. It was recently, the rights to it were recently purchased by Disney, and it is currently slated to have a September release. It all comes around full circle.
That's amazing. Yeah, because Peter Jackson recently made that documentary where he colorized a lot of that World War II footage. Mm-hmm. So I imagine that he's going to be taking that kind of technology and applying it. Oh,
I do know. I'm pretty sure it has been played at festivals, so people have seen it. But it's currently slated to be released in some form or another in September.
Well, I'm looking forward to that. This is pretty amazing. Yeah. Wow.
I know. I felt pretty happy when I found that today, and it was like, the whole story comes full circle.
That's amazing. Oh, wow.
Well, I guess that's going to wrap up episode 1.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody, so much for listening. Dan.
Stay tuned next week.
Yeah. And, of course, find this podcast and more by visiting us at pipedreampodcast.com.
Ooh, what other podcasts are on Pipe
Oh,
Dream
well,
Podcast.com?
we have the Weird Alphabet Podcast. We have Escape from Walt Disney. And we have the archives of shows like Goodnight Hollywood or Thank You Internet, as well as a few more on there. So go check out that website. We would also love to receive emails from you. You can send those emails to notgetmade@gmail.com. Talk to us about movies that you would love us to cover or things that we may have missed. This show is as much about us learning about these stories as it is talking about them. So anything that you have to share, we would love to hear.
You can also connect with us on Twitter at HGTNGM or on Instagram at How Did This Not Get Made? Excellent. And thank you for listening to our first podcast. We hope you enjoyed it, and I actually had a lot of fun researching this as well. So I'm really excited to dive into all these other movies. Oh, it's going to be so much fun.
Yes, indeed.